Dear Roger, to let go home. Dear Roger, dear Roger, dear Roger, to let
There was a time in Sumter County when people moved about more slowly, more deliberately. A time without paved roads and automobiles. A time without snarled traffic, air, and noise pollution. In the earliest days of Sumter County's history, transportation was powered by horse and ox, but mostly by foot. In January of 1828, when the first pioneers settled in what would become Sumter County, they passed through the forest on paths and trails cut much earlier by Creek Indians, brave frontiersmen, and traders. Given the limitations of early land transportation, the seats of county government in Georgia were most often placed in the geographic center of a county. Most pioneers made the trip to the county seat no more than once a month, or even less frequently, often for court day, a special occasion for county citizens which took on the air of a festival. For early settlers, trips to points outside the county were much less common, and were usually made in connection with the sale of a year's cotton crop. When Americus was established as the county seat of Sumter in 1832, the closest center of trade and commerce was Hawkinsville, situated some 40 miles away on the banks of the Ocmulgee River. Sumter County farmers of this era sent their cotton by wagon to gins in Hawkinsville, Macon, and Columbus, over the winding, dusty roads which generally followed old Indian trails. Sharing these roads were the stagecoaches that carried passengers and mail on comparatively slow schedules, a trip from Savannah to Macon by stagecoach taking about 36 hours and costing the passenger a fare of $18. In the early years of Sumter County, it was the towns in Georgia along the banks of navigable rivers that enjoyed a great advantage over their landlocked neighbors. Steamboats were plying all of Georgia's major rivers by the end of the 1830s, cutting in half the travel time from the state's interior to the sea. Thus, in 1835, Martin G. Miller and Royal Jenkins laid out a little town known as Danville on a high limestone bluff overlooking the Flint River in Sumter County. From this point on the Flint, steamboats carried cotton, hides, and vinegar to the Gulf port of Apalachicola, returning with loads of salt, sugar, coffee, tobacco, and various dry goods. In 1847, the citizens of Danville, in an unusual partnership with their rivals in the town of Drayton, located on the opposite side of the Flint River in Dooley County, constructed a steamboat that was christened the Magnolia. Sadly, the vessel lodged on the shoals of Abrams Creek, just north of Albany, on only her second trip. Danville prospered nevertheless, and during its height boasted a Masonic hall, church, warehouse, several stores, a carriage shop and blacksmith shop, as well as a bakery and boarding house operated by John Hardy Newsom and his wife Clarissa, the only free blacks in the county. During the 1830s and 40s, before the arrival of the Iron Horse in Sumter County, the town of Danville appeared to be eclipsing Americus as an important place of trade and commerce. In fact, citizens of Americus traveled to Danville for their goods and supplies. But this would not last. According to an unofficial census of the white population taken by W.B. Gary in Americus in June of 1846, it appears that the county seat's population totaled only 177 persons, some 37 families, and by 1850, the population had risen to only 300. Though slow growth marked the first 2 decades of America's history, the coming of a railroad would soon cause a boom in population. The railroad era in Georgia began earlier, in 1833, as state leaders scrambled to establish rail lines to compete with the South Carolina Railroad, which linked Hamburg, South Carolina, just across the Savannah River from Augusta, with the port city of Charleston. Citizens of Savannah were especially fearful of the damage the South Carolina Railroad was doing to reroute the cotton traffic that had for decades been flowing downriver to their port. Thus was born the Central Railroad and Canal Company, officially chartered on December 20th, 1833. By 1843, the Central's main line from Savannah would reach Macon, and within another 3 years, the new town of Atlanta, known first as Terminus and then Marthasville, would boast rail connections with Chattanooga to the north, Augusta to the east, and Macon to the south. Meanwhile, a syndicate with close ties to the Central Railroad was forming in Macon in 1847 for the purpose of projecting a line from Macon to the Chattahoochee River through the agriculturally rich lands of southwest Georgia. Arriving in Oglethorpe in 1851, the Southwestern Railroad planned to continue building to the Chattahoochee by way of Pondtown, known as Ellaville today, and Lumpkin, the county seat of Stewart County. Americus leaders were horrified by the prospect of the railroad line bypassing them, thus diverting the cotton trade and causing the town's inevitable decline. If it can be said that Americus owes its success to any single person, then that person must be Timothy Matthews Furlow, a prosperous merchant, planter, and politician who moved to Sumter County in 1849. Furlow led the town's effort in 1853 to raise $75,000 in order to purchase shares of stock in the Southwestern, thus assuring the deflection of its route to Americus. With the announcement of the Southwestern's new terminus came tremendous growth in Sumter County, both in trade and population. By the time of the first train's arrival in Americus on October 1, 1854, the town's population had swelled to 1,147.
The citizens of the town of Americus were absolutely amazed on the morning of October 1, 1854, when the first locomotive engine pulled into the depot, where many of our older residents will remember the Central Depot at the intersection of Cotton Avenue and McGarrett Street. The reaction, of course, of most people was extremely positive because they had wanted it so badly and were glad to see it, and there was much hurrahing. But for people from out of the county and other rural areas who had absolutely no experience with the Iron Horse, the reaction was one that was bordered on fear because of the sound of the engine and the smoke and the fury that came with it and the clamor that was raised. And some people actually left town in fear after seeing the Iron Horse in all its glory pull into the station. But for most people in the town, the reaction was much more positive, and especially the people who were responsible for bringing it here, the capitalists of the community who would work so hard to get it brought here. And the fact that they could see that the railroad was the key to the economic development of Americus, and in fact their wishes and hopes in the 1850s were realized by the end of the century because of that railroad's arrival in 1854. Americus, by the end of the century, in the 1890 census, was the 8th largest city in the state of Georgia, and that can be attributed completely to the advent of the railroads.
The booming community now boasted 5 dry goods stores, 4 grocery stores, 2 hotels, 3 churches, 3 schools, 4 drugstores, 13 lawyers, 8 doctors, 61 carpenters, 7 brick masons, 1 carriage shop, 3 blacksmith shops, 2 milliner establishments, 2 harness shops, 1 tailor shop, 1 tin shop, and 1 jewelry shop. In addition, by 1855, the town had 2 weekly newspapers, the Sumter Republican and the Southwestern News. In 1854, the county's population stood at 11,789 persons, and the value of taxable property in the county had risen to over $6 million. On the eve of the Civil War, Americus and Sumter County were booming. The Southwestern was successful as well, having completed by 1860 both its connection to Albany and its line from Smithville to the Chattahoochee River via Dawson and Cuthbert, with an additional branch extending to Fort Gaines. Appropriately, the Southwestern honored Timothy Furlow in 1860 when the railroad named one of its Baldwin passenger locomotives the T.M. Furlow. The locomotive remained in service until 1886. With secession and war in 1861, Georgia's comparatively young railroad system would be put to the test. The Civil War was the first war in which railroads played a decisive role. Railroads moved men and materiel more efficiently than had ever before been possible. Georgia's railroads became the target of enemy aggression on two significant occasions. In 1862 with Andrew's Raid, also known as the Great Locomotive Chase, and again in 1864 with Sherman's infamous Atlanta campaign and subsequent march to the sea. Though the Southwestern Railroad was, for most of the war, too far from the lines of battle to be directly involved in action, the railroad did serve as a vital supply line for the Confederacy. At the war's opening, volunteer units with names like the Sumter Flying Artillery, the Americus Volunteer Rifles, and the Sumter Light Guards marched with great confidence and much fanfare behind the Americus Brass Band from the public square to the railroad station. Waiting at the depot were trains ready to take the volunteers off to what they believed would be a short and glorious war. As the war dragged on, the same railroad returned the many dead or wounded men to their grieving families in Americus and Sumter County. The Southwestern Railroad also shipped the Army's much-needed food supplies from Sumter and surrounding counties, an area of Georgia that came to be called the Egypt of the Confederacy because of its abundant crops. Under the direction of Uriah B. Harold, Confederate commissary agent, trains loaded with meat and meal rolled through the county on their way to starving Confederate troops. Among the settlements in Sumter County along the main line of the Southwestern, Andersonville stands out as the most infamous. Originally designated as Station Number 8 and later renamed for John W. Anderson, the railroad's superintendent of construction, Anderson Station in 1863 consisted of a post office, a depot, a blacksmith shop, and stable, a couple of general stores, 2 saloons, a school, a Methodist church, and about a dozen houses. In 1863, the Confederate Army's urgent need for another prison camp eventually led officials to Sumter County and Andersonville, a location safely distant from the enemy, adequate in its ability to supply food and pure drinking water to the prison, and conveniently situated along the Southwestern's main line from Macon to Albany. From 1864 to 1865, during the 14 months of the prison's operation, some 45,000 Union prisoners were transported by rail to Sumter County.
The railroad was especially efficient in delivering Union prisoners to the new prison camp called Camp Sumter, better known to most people as Andersonville Prison, in February of 1864. The big concern for the people of Americus in that time period, of course, was the fear, and it was a real fear for people, not that anything ever actually happened, but they were deeply concerned about the possibility of Union prisoners escaping and committing depredations upon the good citizens of Americus and other communities in Sumter County. So this fear was real, and fortunately for the people of the community, it was not realized at any time.
By the war's end, the Southwestern Railroad had served the Confederacy well for 4 years without the benefit of much-needed materials for its repairs and capital improvements. The railroad's annual report of 1865 describes the condition of the line as being greatly deteriorated. With the war now over, the monumental task of rebuilding could begin.
Oh, the train's off the track, and I can't get it back, and I can't get a letter to my home.
While Georgia's existing railroads were busy rebuilding and expanding their lines following the war, many schemes for new railroads were being developed by both honest and dishonest entrepreneurs. In 1866 alone, the Georgia General Assembly granted charters to 10 new railroad companies. Of those chartered, only 6 of the proposed lines were actually constructed. In Americus, the original wooden depot was in very poor condition according to the Southwestern's annual report of 1868. By the time the next year's report was published on August the 1st, work had begun on a new brick combination freight and passenger station. Though empty and dilapidated today, the structure remains standing.
When the railroad arrived in 1854, there was a simple, small wooden structure that served as the passenger depot for the train. One of our more prominent citizens, a local jeweler named Charles Fricker, who arrived after the war, described it in a reminiscence 30 years after the fact as being similar to a small box, although he said it served the community well, and it lasted for about 40 years into the late 1880s when it was finally demolished. In the interim, in 1869, the Southwestern Railroad had decided to construct a large brick passenger and freight depot, which of course served the community much better. And that structure still remains with us to this day, fortunately. It's one of the few remaining railroad artifacts in our town. And it would ultimately be replaced in 1890 by the Victorian Central Depot that so many of our older citizens remember so well until its final demise in 1973.
On December 1st, 1869, shortly after the construction of the new Americus Depot, the Central Railroad and Banking Company leased the 258-mile Southwestern Railroad. By 1870, the Southwestern's line from Smithville had crossed the Chattahoochee River and had made connection with Montgomery, Alabama. Facing no competition in southwest Georgia and virtually no government regulation, the Central Railroad was able to charge what Sumter County residents believed to be unjust tariffs, thus causing a decline in business. Americus men responded by petitioning the State Constitutional Convention of 1868, asking that it give the General Assembly broad regulatory powers over the railroads. As Americus men battled with the Central over freight rates, leaders in the surrounding counties of Marion, Sly, Webster, and Stewart began proposing the construction of new lines that would allow them to ship and receive directly by rail rather than moving freight to and from Americus by wagon. One such new line, the Buena Vista Railroad, began operating daily trains in 1884 between Buena Vista and Andersonville, thus achieving a connection with the Central of Georgia. The Buena Vista Railroad changed its name to the Buena Vista and Ellaville Railroad, or BV&E, in 1885. Originally planned to terminate in Americus rather than Andersonville, the BV&E Railroad, according to some Americus citizens at the time, would have diverted trade to Ellaville or Buena Vista rather than bring it to Americus. Nevertheless, when the BV&E began to falter in 1887 due to insufficient revenue, local men invested in the line and relocated its terminus in Americus by constructing about 8 miles of new track. Americus mogul Uriah Bullock Harold served as the president of the BV&E, and 7 of the road's 13 directors were Americus men as well. In 1888, 5 months after the new line's completion, the Savannah and Western Railroad, a wholly owned subsidiary of the Central of Georgia, purchased the BV&E. With the construction of additional trackage linking Buena Vista to Columbus and Columbus to Birmingham, Alabama, this road would become one of the Central of Georgia's principal main lines, linking Birmingham with connections to Florida via the Atlantic Coastline Railroad at Albany, Georgia. Chief among those protesting the Central's unfair rates in the 1870s and early 80s was Samuel H. Hawkins. Hawkins, a successful lawyer, banker, and civic leader, advocated the establishment of a state railroad commission to regulate tariffs. The Central of Georgia retaliated by removing the name Americus from its system maps and instead designating the growing town as Way Station No. 9. During the early 1880s, the combined prospects of Americus losing the wagon trade of nearby planters and being bypassed by new railroad lines caused great alarm among far-sighted business and community leaders like Samuel H. Hawkins. Thus, Hawkins, along with other wealthy Americus investors, organized the Americus, Preston, and Lumpkin Railroad in 1884 to ensure that Americus would continue to dominate the region's trade. The original charter of the AP&L called for a narrow gauge or 3-foot line to be built from Americus west to Preston and Lumpkin, both of which were county seats without railroads. After reaching Lumpkin in 1886, the charter was amended, allowing for an extension to be built from Lumpkin north to Louisville and from Americus east to Abbeville on the Ocmulgee River. By 1889, the railroad began operating 5 steamboats to Savannah and Brunswick via Darien. Hawkins and his associates' dream expanded significantly in 1888 when they decided to convert the narrow gauge line to standard gauge and extend it both east and west to create a direct route between Montgomery, Alabama and Savannah, Georgia. In the same year, the road was appropriately renamed the Savannah, Americus and Montgomery Railway, or SAM. Upon its completion, the SAM's main line would stand at 340 miles in length. The effect of the new railroad's arrival in the rural areas east and west of Americus was immediate. Villages and towns sprang up overnight. Many were planned directly by the railroad itself or its holding company. The Americus Investment Company established Cordele in what was then Dooley County. The town was named in honor of Sam Hawkins' wife and his eldest daughter, both of whom were named Cordelia. East of Cordele, new towns were given names like Seville, Rhine, and Lyons as a result of the Hawkins family's recent travels in Europe. In Sumter County, the first new community to develop as a result of the AP&L Railroad was Plains. 3 earlier settlements, the Plains of Dura, Magnolia Springs, and Lebanon, existed near the location of the railroad's projected main line through western Sumter County prior to its arrival in 1885. As the tracks approached the Plains of Dura, residents of these settlements moved to be nearer the railroad. Milton Leander Hudson gave the land for the depot as well as the new town of Plains. He also served as the town's first postmaster and railroad agent. Though officially chartered in 1892, Leslie began earlier as a tiny settlement in connection with the Bailey Plantation east of Americus. Originally named Jeb, for J.E. Bailey, the community's name was mistakenly corrupted by the post office into Job. In 1890, the name was changed to Leslie in honor of J.W. Bailey's younger daughter. Leslie grew rapidly as a result of the railroad. By 1907, the town of approximately 600 residents boasted a high school, 14 mercantile stores, a hotel, a wagon and buggy manufacturing company, a hardware and furniture company, turpentine still, and a cotton gin and warehouse. A short distance further east, the Americus Investment Company established the town of DeSoto when it bought and subdivided a parcel of land owned by Samuel Hawkins since 1877. The town's name derives from the legend that tells of the Spanish explorer Hernando de Soto stopping briefly in the area in 1540 and digging a well to provide his men and horses with drinking water. Though the town of DeSoto was quickly becoming a community of some size following the railroad's arrival, a massive fire cut short that growth in 1906. Only a small portion of the business block was rebuilt, and the town never regained its original size. Several smaller settlements, such as Huntington and Cobb, also developed along the Sam Railroad in Sumter County. Consisting of only a small depot, post office, and perhaps a store or two, communities such as this were very dependent upon the railroad for their connection to the larger world. In Americus, the result of the Sam Railroad's development was a second building and population boom, the likes of which had not been seen since the first boom in the 1850s. By 1890, the town ranked 8th in the state in terms of its population, which stood at 6,398 and represented a 75% increase over the town's population in 1880.
And the second boom, after the or coinciding with the construction of the east-west line, the Savannah, Americus and Montgomery Railroad in the 1880s and early 90s, was larger than the first, at least in terms of absolute numbers, if not in percentage of growth. And the town as we know it today, Americus, largely came into being in that period. Our downtown commercial district is still overwhelmingly composed of buildings built in the 1880s and 90s, perhaps to a lesser extent the first decade or so of the 20th century. What we think of as our older residential districts today Lee Street, Church Street, Taylor Street, College Street, Reese Park, and streets adjoining and connecting to these were built up mainly in that period. All those streets had existed in the earlier period. What happened was that large lots were subdivided.
New businesses included the Americus Guano Company, the Americus Oil Company, the Americus Illuminating and Power Company, the Americus Construction Company, and the Americus Grocery Company, as well as the AP&L Warehouse and Compress Company. In 1891, the railroad constructed a large new shop facility on the east side of Americus. During this era, in addition to many new downtown commercial buildings being constructed, a new county and city government complex was built. Moreover, the first electrically driven streetcars in Georgia operated in Americus. But of all the new construction and development related to the boom of the late 80s and early 90s, the town's crowning achievement was the Windsor Hotel. The great boom was halted by the announcement of the Sam Railroads being placed into receivership on December 10, 1892. Unable to meet January interest payments on the railroad's debt, local Sam investors were forced to take this drastic step to ensure that local obligations would be met before sending any money to pay northern creditors. The railroad was short on cash for a number of reasons, including a new state law limiting the issuance of railroad stocks and bonds. The new law coming at a time when the Sam desperately needed additional capital to cover the cost of building its expensive Montgomery extension. As Americus began to see the Sam's crisis lead to the failure of the Bank of Americus and the Americus Investment Company, the railroad's conductors and engineers made matters worse by launching a strike to protest the fact that they had not yet received satisfactory new contracts under the receivers. When the situation grew more severe after the entire country experienced a financial panic in 1893, the Savannah, Americus and Montgomery was sold to John Skelton Williams of Richmond, Virginia, who reorganized the company as the Georgia and Alabama Railway in 1895. Williams merged his railroad interests to form the Seaboard Airline Railway on July 1, 1900, making the Georgia and Alabama a division of the Seaboard by 1902. Thus ended the era when local men controlled the iron roads through Sumter County.
Have you ever heard about that railroad rag?
From the turn of the century until the onset of the Great Depression, railroads enjoyed a golden age during which lines expanded, railroad technology improved, and revenues grew. This was the era before the automobile came to dominate passenger travel and before the truck captured the freight business. It was a time when even the most remote hamlets in Georgia were connected to the greater world by passenger trains, a time when mail and express deliveries, as well as every other conceivable form of freight, moved by rail. In Sumter County, carloads of agricultural products such as cotton, peaches, and watermelons were loaded at the numerous freight houses, packing sheds, and rural sidings along the central and seaboard main lines. The railroads also hauled various forest products and large quantities of fertilizer. By 1919, Plains was shipping 76 cars of hogs and cattle, more cars than from any other single point of production in the United States at this time. Until 1951, communities east and west of Americus enjoyed the ability to board one of the Seaboard's passenger trains and travel into the county seat to shop or conduct business. Many of the county's rural citizens rode trains 11 and 12, variously known as the Shoefly, Dummy, or Butthead. The names Dummy and Butthead deriving from the Seaboard's cost-saving use of unusual rail motor cars over the lightly traveled Savannah to Montgomery main line. Though not great revenue producers for the railroad, these passenger trains provided a vital service to the rural residents living in Sumter County settlements such as Archery, the location of a Seaboard Railroad section crew, and the boyhood home of Jimmy Carter.
Yes, when I was young, we had 4 passenger trains a day that came by our house. 2 going west toward Preston and Richland, and 2 going east toward Americus and ultimately Savannah. And the train didn't ordinarily stop in Archery, where I lived. If you wanted to ride to, say, Americus on the train, you had to go walk up the railroad track, and there was a little red leather flag there lying on the railroad track right beside it. And you would take that little red flag and you would stick it in a hole in the cross tie, and then when the engineer came along and saw the red flag sticking up, he would slow down and stop the train, and you could get on the train and you could ride to Plains or to Americus. I think it cost 15 cents to ride from Archery to Americus. And we'd get off a train in the middle of Americus and maybe go to a movie or something like that. And then we'd go back to the depot in Americus and get on the train and ride back out to Archery. And of course the engineer would know when we were on the train that we didn't want to get off in Plains. We wanted to go on over to Archery and get off. So it was a very nice arrangement with a constant ability to go from Archery to Americus twice a day, or to go from Archery to westward toward Columbus twice a day. And it didn't cost very much. But it was I think a very convenient sort of transportation that we don't have anymore around Plains.
My remembrance of the train at Archery, earlier in the early middle 30s, I can remember when there were 2 trains that would come to Archery. One was a passenger train and the other was a freight train. The passenger train had 2 coaches. One coach was for the white and one for the black. The Archery flag station was near the St. Mark EME Church. In order for you to catch the passenger train, you had to flag it down. And to flag it down, you had to use a white handkerchief. If you used any other color handkerchief, the train wouldn't stop. But you could actually purchase a ticket at Archery and make connection to any place in the United States. That's just how fascinating that train was. And we call it dummy. It was a little dummy, 2 coaches. The freight train was the livelihood for everybody. In other words, it hauled all of the farm products and timber. It was used quite frequently over Dumas for taking the logs and the pulpwood that was carried to various places. So the freight train was a livelihood for the entire area. The section houses that were located in Archery was primarily for the workers on the railroad. There were a few workers that didn't live in the section houses, but they lived in the Archery community. But we call them shanty houses, or shanty houses, or section houses. The foreman lived at the first house. Mr. Ed Watson was the foreman, and there were several other people that I can remember. Willie Wilson is his name. We call him Willie Nation, but Willie Wilson is his name. Eddie Pryor. C. Whitfield worked on the railroad also, and long ago it was Martin King. He was also a railroad worker.
The economic importance of the Seaboard Airline Railway in Sumter County cannot be measured solely by its role in providing transportation for the county's freight and passengers. The Seaboard was itself an employer of more than 300 men and women in Sumter County during its peak of operation, with the Alabama Division's headquarters being located in Americus until 1956. In the early years, Americus was a major shop on the Seaboard, and in later years it continued to be an important repair and refueling facility. Over on the Central of Georgia Railroad, during the height of passenger service, there were as many as 14 daily passenger trains through the county. Many of the famous Florida-bound name trains passed through Americus on the Central, including the Seminole, the Flamingo, the Dixie Flyer, the Sun Chaser, and most famous of all, the City of Miami. One of the Central of Georgia Railway's most important roles in Sumter County began during World War I with the opening in 1918 of Suther Field, a military aviation training camp established 4 miles northeast of Americus along the Central's Macon to Albany main line. The railroad ran spur tracks into the camp to serve the supply depot, which was sending supplies to other training camps throughout the southeast. The Central also provided a station to serve the passenger traffic generated by Sutherfield. During the Second World War, the railroad's capabilities would once again be put to the test. Hundreds of troop and military supply trains passed through Americus and Sumter County. And once again, the railroads carried Sumter County's brave young men off to war. For many, departing from the railroad station would be their last memory of home. After World War II, the automobile, truck, and airplane were rapidly taking the railroad's passenger and freight business. To survive, railroads began discontinuing passenger trains and abandoning their less profitable lines. The last passenger train to serve Americus departed the Central Depot on May 1, 1971 in the early morning hours. And in 1973, with no further use for the building, the Central of Georgia, owned by the Southern Railway since 1963, demolished the station. The Seaboard Depot in Plains survives, having made a brief comeback when it was reopened on April 18, 1975 to serve as Jimmy Carter's presidential campaign headquarters. It was also from this depot that the Peanut Special departed, an Amtrak train that carried friends and supporters from Plains to the inauguration in Washington, D.C. Today, little remains as evidence of the railroad's important role in establishing Americus and Sumter County. Most of the depots are gone, the seaboard shops have vanished, there are fewer customers served, and the railroads themselves have disappeared into the vast corporate structure resulting from the mega mergers that created two giant lines, the Norfolk Southern and the CSX. Despite the apparent death of traditional railroading, there are current signs that railroads, even passenger trains, will make a comeback in southwest Georgia.
I rode the Southern, I rode the Atlantic. I rode the Southern, I rode the Atlantic.
Though less obvious to citizens of Sumter County today because of their few experiences with railroads beyond waiting for the occasional train at a grade crossing, railroads still play an important role in the economic vitality of the community. The former Central of Georgia, now Norfolk Southern, serves several customers in the area, including a large fertilizer plant in Americus. In addition to steady freight business, the old Central Main Line will likely see the return of passenger service as well, with a proposed state-sponsored intercity rail network that will link Atlanta and Albany by 2006. The Savannah, Americus and Montgomery Railroad, predecessor of the Seaboard Airline, the Seaboard Coastline, and the CSX, is now a state-owned right-of-way operated by the Heart of Georgia Railroad. Local residents along the Hoggs Main Line hope to see the return of passenger service to their communities in the form of a tourist line that is being developed to run from Cordele through Sumter County to the newly developed National Park site at Archery. Like their predecessors in the 1850s and 1880s, far-sighted and civic-minded Sumter Countyans are hard at work today to secure new railroad services for the community. Perhaps the coming decades will bring the next railroad boom to Sumter County as the Iron Horse is reborn.
I ran from town to town, been looking for two blue eyes.